And next up, we have Dr. Brian Roth from MSU, and Brian's been running a diet study on Lakes Huron and Michigan. And I really wanted to include this because I think it really puts in perspective for river steelhead fishermen just how much steelhead also rely on the big lake. All right, that's where they're eating and growing. So Brian's got some great insight on that. And if you can share your screen now, Brian, we should be
awesome. Sure. Thanks, Dan. So I'm really happy to be here speaking to you today about the Predator Diet Project. I did try to emphasize steelhead, but I think sometimes helps to place a single species in context. And so I do include some data from other fishes as well. So first of all, this is a fairly substantial effort to collect all these diets, and we collaborate with many management agencies around the basin, as well as some of you, some volunteer anglers and sport fishing groups who have assisted the project either with stomach collection or through financial donations, of which we are very much appreciative. The goals of the project as a whole can really be boiled down to a couple points. One is to determine the species-specific diets for predators in both Lake Michigan and Lake Huron. And the point of this is to develop a lake-wide view of what these predators are eating. So here I have salmonine predators, but we also include walleye on Lake Huron. And one of the components of this is that we know that the diets of these predators vary both in terms of what time of year it is, as well as where those fish are caught. But parsing that data out is a priority so that we can more accurately identify what the predator diets are. Unfortunately, COVID-19 halted almost all diet collection this past summer. In addition, it delayed the analysis of the diets from the previous year, and we pretty much just finished those in late November of 2020. And so I'm going to present to you data through 2019 simply because we really don't have enough data from 2020 to present that yet. We're also doing stable isotope analysis, which is essentially a way to chemically trace how energy flows through these food webs. And COVID-19 delayed that too, and we're just starting to get some results back. But I won't present that today, maybe next time. So we've been sampling quite a few fish. So in every year we get somewhere between 1,500 and 2,500 samples, stomachs from all predators on both lakes. That may not seem like a ton, but it's a large number. Trust me, we don't have enough freezers to keep all those stomachs at one time. We kind of have to ask our partners to hold on to them for a while for us. So when we look at who's getting us these stomachs, this is kind of an important component, is that our partners are really, really valuable in getting us our stomachs. In particular, some of those creel agents that Tracy was talking about are extremely valuable at getting us diets, as well as some of the survey vessels as well. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, those folks that are at tournaments, determining if there's coded wire tags, they were also getting stomachs from us through 2019. We also have tribal partners that get us stomachs. And then the one that I'd like to highlight here is that we've tried on many occasions to get volunteers to submit stomachs to us, and we're still kind of struggling to get a large number of volunteers. We're hoping to get that up around 1,000, and so far we have yet to crack 100. And so if you're on this call and listening, and you fish in particular the big lakes, please let us know, and we can certainly try to connect and get more stomachs from volunteer anglers. When we look at space, where are we getting these samples? On the left here is a map of the statistical districts of Lake Michigan. And so as you can see, the Michigan side is all MM. Michigan, right? And here on the western side, you see WM, Wisconsin, Lake Michigan, right? And so you can see how many fish of each species that we're collecting from each of these statistical districts. In particular, you can see here in kind of Michigan 2 through 8, we're doing a pretty good job of collecting fish. Steelhead are relatively rare, and as another speaker indicated, that in Wisconsin, they seem to be I think it was Jay mentioned that they seem to be catching a lot of steelhead, and we are seeing that as well. We do struggle, though, in some statistical districts to collect a lot of fish, and this is just due to coverage and a lack of volunteers submitting stomachs from these areas. In addition, when we look seasonally, almost all of our diets come from April through September. We nearly get almost zero fish, anything from January through March on both lakes, and then after October. And as it turns out, these Lake Huron walleye that you see in October and November, I know people are fishing during these times. We're just not getting a lot of stomachs. And I know that because I caught these fish and donated those walleye to the project, and I saw plenty of anglers out there. So we're still struggling to get those diets in fall and winter. Overall, we have approximately 12,000 stomachs from 2012, some historical stomachs included in there, all accessible to us in a database. And yes, we do have some gaps in species, time, and space. And some of this is due to decreased angler effort at certain times of the year, but also our ability to efficiently gather diets over a really large geographical area. And we're hoping to rectify this by speaking at events like this to get folks motivated to hopefully donate some stomachs to us. So what I'll present to you is going to look, the prey items that you see are going to follow kind of these 3-letter codes. And these codes are simply just to keep the legends of the grass relatively short. And so ALE is alewife, RGB is round goby, SMT is rainbow smelt, SCU is sculpins. We don't see a lot of those, but we include them anyways. COR are corriganines such as bloater, cisco, whitefish. In diets, when they're heavily digested, those species are really hard to tell apart, but we do know that they belong to this group of fishes, so we just call them all corriganines. YEP is yellow perch, and then you'll see this kind of light orange color, and that's just fish, and that represents every other fish species besides the ones that are listed on the slide. But most oftentimes it includes things like emerald shiners and spot-tail shiners, mainly cyprinids, but we also get some really weird ones, like we'll occasionally get a brown bullhead or a white bass or something in a diet. Okay, so we lump those all together. And then INV are invertebrates. So that includes all terrestrial as well as aquatic insects. For steelhead, of course, it's actually mainly terrestrial insects. So when we look at Lake Huron, I'm going to put this up here just for comparison so that you can see what species that we're looking at. Just so you're clear in terms of the predator species down here at the bottom. ATS is Atlantic salmon. CHS is Chinook salmon, coho salmon, lake trout, rainbow trout or steelhead, of course, and walleye. And year after year, we see kind of some similar trends in that these species have relatively diverse diets. So I don't expect you to necessarily parse out every single prey item from this, but notice the kind of mosaic of colors that exist. And that indicates fairly high diversity in prey consumption in Lake Huron. Certainly, we see that Chinook salmon, like alewife and some smelt, right? Walleye, like over here, like gobies, as well as yellow perch here in red, and other fishes as well. Occasionally, some gizzard shad or smelt will show up in their diets as well. Lake trout here really like gobies. There may have been fewer slightly in 2019, but 2018 appears to be our low bar, and it's still well over 30% of their diet is lake trout, and it can be as high as almost 80% of their diet is gobies. And then if you look at steelhead here, they like bugs, and a substantial portion of their diet is actually bugs in Lake Huron. The rest of their diet is primarily made up of things like rainbow smelt and a few odd gobies thrown in there as well. Let's contrast that now with Lake Michigan. So now here I have brown trout, BNT, Chinook salmon, coho salmon, lake trout, and steelhead. And those are the 5 primary predators that we get in Lake Michigan. And you can see it's a much simpler picture. Everyone likes alewife. And even though brown trout incorporate some gobies into their diet, they're not quite like lake trout. Lake trout really apparently like gobies, whereas up to 35 to 40% of their diet in 2019 was made up of gobies. And so it may help to look at this not just in that big kind of multi-panel graph, but let's look at individual species side by side. So I'm guessing I didn't put the lake on these graphs, and I did that on purpose, and I'm hoping that you can kind of, you know, as a quiz, figure out which lake these came from. If you're unsure, remember, everyone likes alewife on Lake Michigan. And so as you can see, in every single year for which we have diet data, alewife make up somewhere around 98% of Chinook salmon diets. In Lake Huron, that number is slightly lower. There's simply not as many alewife in Lake Huron. However, we do see that proportion of diet made up by rainbow smelt. So in Lake Huron, where there's fewer alewife, Chinook make this up by eating more smelt. Coho are relatively similar, in at least in Lake Michigan, where at least usually 98 to 99% of their diet is alewife. We don't catch that many in Lake Huron, and so this graph may be slightly deceiving. However, you can see that their diet is really diverse. So this big red here is all the species of fish, other than those ones that we've listed that we catch or that we see in coho salmon diets. And a lot of these actually are those cyprinids. So things like emerald shiners. We see a lot of those in coho salmon diets. Lake trout, everyone, particularly the open lake fishermen, are particularly interested in lake trout diets. And we do see some commonalities between lake trout and Lake Huron and Lake Michigan, that they are the primary predator of gobies in these lakes. And so what we see is a much higher proportion of gobies integrated into lake trout diets as compared to, say, Chinook or even coho or even brown trout, right? In Lake Huron, where there are very few alewife, yes, they do manage to find a few, but they've switched almost entirely to either gobies or smelt. Now, finally, steelhead. So I brought up those other species. So now we can kind of place steelhead in a context, right? How do they compare to these other species? Well, on Lake Michigan, they're actually pretty similar, right? They're eating a lot of alewife. And if they're not eating alewife, they're eating a lot of bugs. Okay? And that holds up just about every year. On Lake Huron, on the other hand, you see almost the complete opposite. Usually, up to 80% of their diet can be invertebrates, at least in our samples. And what isn't invertebrates is either some diverse fish species or rainbow smelt. Occasionally, they do eat gobies. Let's look at this data a little bit deeper. So I'm concentrating here on Lake Michigan because it kind of shows a relatively consistent trend. So when we look at the month of the year, so 4 would be April, 10 would be October, right? we can see like the seasonal shift in diet. So early in the year, April, May, steelhead tend to eat more bugs and then integrate kind of more diverse fishes with very few alewife in their diet. But as the summer progresses, you can see that their diet shifts almost entirely to alewife. And it's interesting, whether we combine the data or look at it year by year, we see a fairly similar trend. And this indicates either they're actually doing this or our samples are strange in some way in those early months and not so much later. When we look at the kind of spatial pattern of steelhead diets, we see that there's some fairly consistent trends here. So overall, when we look year by year, of course, most of their diet is alewife, but here in MH3, we see a little bit different, as well as maybe MH4. So apparently up in the northern parts of the lake, they're integrating more bugs and other fish into their diet. But, you know, who knows? Our sample sizes for each of these statistical districts may be low in some instances, which is why you see missing bars, right? We didn't catch any fish in those statistical districts. So when we look at Lake Huron, we do see a seasonal trend. And I apologize for cropping that off. This is April, May, June, July, August, September. We don't get a lot of fish overall from Lake Huron. As Tracy indicated, our catch rates are low. However, it may help more to look at this here, this all years combined. And what we see is that for the few fish that we've happened to capture in April, they were packed with gobies, which is really strange. However, similar to Lake Michigan, at least in May and June, steelhead are eating quite a few bugs. In Lake Huron, apparently this bug season goes on longer in that they're also eating a ton of bugs even into July. However, in August and September, they've now moved to those open water fishes. Now, this may represent a shift in perhaps angler strategy. We're not sure, or it may actually represent what steelhead are keying in on. So our next steps in this is to analyze all those 2020 stomachs. We think we got about maybe 1,200 combined from both lakes. We were able to get out a little bit later in the summer, attended a few tournaments, and other partners gave us some stomachs, which is great. And then we're going to start collecting more stomachs. So starting coming in April, or for those of you on this workshop, if you would like to collect some stomachs for us starting now, we would be really happy. These are, we're sticking to the open water fish rather than those fish that were captured in rivers. However, I'm guessing many of you are multifunctional anglers and will fish where the fish are. And so if you do happen to catch some fish on the big lakes, we'd be happy to take those off your hands. And unfortunately, this is the last year of data collection. At least that's what we have planned so far. And so hopefully if I come and talk to you next year, we'll have 2020 and some 2021 diet data. And that'll be our snapshot of diets over the past several years. So it's a relatively short talk, simply because I know that oftentimes this presentation drums up questions. I do have some additional slides, but I won't go into those. I'd rather take more time for questions, particularly since at some point here, I got to put my kids to bed. So if you're interested, please contact me. My email address is there. I'm also on Twitter. I have a lab website. And then if you aren't aware of it, we also have a Facebook group. It's the Huron, Michigan Diet Study that you can just search for it on Facebook and you'll find project updates, etc., as well as cool pictures of weird things that we find in diets. So thank you.
Thanks, Brian. And now that you're not sharing the slideshow, you should be able to see the.
Yeah, I can. Joe asks, Why do steelhead eat more terrestrial invertebrates as opposed to aquatic invertebrates? That's a really good question. There is some thought. So my diet study is not the first one. Others have done previous studies. And one thought is that where anglers are catching the steelhead on the big lakes is kind of where there's differences in temperature. So temperature breaks, right? Or current breaks. And in those areas, bugs that accumulate basically at these in these vortices and get shuffled down into the water column where steelhead are able to consume them. And so that's one thought. I don't know if we know the true answer, but that one is as good as any explanation that I've seen. Okay, it looks like this diet preference may reflect the amount of that specific bait fish in the lake. Yeah, Linda, thank you. That's a really, I think, a really perceptive comment. Certainly, that is the case, right? Particularly in terms of alewife, right? So, for whatever reason, all these fish love alewife. It's weird, they stink, right? But and they make your Chinook salmon not taste that great. But apparently they're easy to catch, or they're delicious, or they operate like Chinook salmon's prey in their native range, right? So in their native range, Chinook salmon really love Pacific herring, which are pretty analogous to alewife. So whatever the case may be, they're going to eat alewife. Personally, I just think they're dumb and fall prey to all these predators. In addition, these predators, with the exception perhaps of Chinook salmon, they're not robots, right? So they are going to respond to other prey. So we don't actually know how many round goby are out there, right? We know that there's a lot. Right, but certainly we don't know how many. So the exact correlation between what we find in the diets and how many prey fish are in a particular system, it's a little mixed, right? Of what a fish prefers to eat versus how much is there. Lee, is it likely that alewives predominate in the diets of Lake Michigan salmonines because they are still relative? Yes. Are there other explanations? No, that's predominantly it. Alewives are still relatively abundant in Lake Michigan compared to Lake Huron. In fact, the only place where we find alewife in Lake Huron fish is way up at the north, in the northern part. Fish return to us out of ports like Rogers City. That's the only place where we find alewife, and as it turns out, that's predominantly where we're getting our Chinook samples from in Lake Huron, is way up north. And so Chinook are basically like, where the alewife, I'm going there. And so whether that be up in the northern part of Lake Huron or moving from Lake Huron all the way into Lake Michigan, that's what they're doing. How do the sizes of salmonines compare between Lake Huron and Lake Michigan? Are the different diets between the lakes affecting fish sizes? That's a difficult one. So first of all, we have more or less a lower limit on what size of fish that we can have in this study, right? Particularly if we're taking angler caught fish, we only get samples from those fish that are legal. And so there is kind of a lower end to the size that we're getting. Oddly enough, in terms of the average size of fish that we're catching, certainly the Chinook are likely to be bigger in Lake Michigan than they are in Lake Huron. But I don't know the actual, I don't have a graph to show what the differences in sizes are. But my guess is that there is a ton of overlap. There's a lot of overlap for all the species.
If I could chime in for a second, Brian,
Yeah.
If you think back to like 04, 05, when the Chinooks were really crashing after the alewife crashed in Lake Huron, you could just see how skinny those fish were. They were just nowhere near as robust as the Lake Michigan fish that had the alewife to eat. And now things might get a little more muddy, like you say, because a lot of those Chinooks especially are moving from Lake Huron into Lake Michigan to feed. And then when they return, they may get caught in Lake Huron, but they've done their growing in Lake Michigan. And I have to wonder, like seeing the questions here and hearing your talk and the focus on steelhead, I think one of the take homes for me, even though maybe we can't connect the dots 100% with science, is the really good fishing we have in Lake Michigan. If we see the difference in the creel, the number of fish harvested in Lake Michigan, the size of a lot of the fish returning to the rivers in Lake Michigan basin, you got to think that might have something to do with the fact that those fish have a lot of alewife to eat. And then you draw the line between all the other predators that are also relying on alewife, and the fact that alewife numbers have been going down. Is it reasonable to assume that what we're seeing with some of the river fisheries not doing as well in recent years for steelhead really has a lot to do with what's going on in the lake?
Thanks, Dan.
Is that a reasonable assumption, you think?
Maybe. Yeah, I mean, it's always complicated, right? Like, certainly, I'm not going to make any assertions regarding whether steelhead out in Lake Huron are returning in fewer numbers because they're dying of starvation, right? Like that's not super common. But certainly in terms of ability to find fish forage, it appears that those fish in Lake Michigan are much more successful than they are in Lake Huron, and that does have implications for things like growth in particular, right? And so, yeah, certainly in terms of survival, I don't know, I'm not gonna go above my head on that one, but certainly in terms of growth, it makes more sense to have more bigger fish in Lake Michigan than you would find in Huron. Tom, no, some wreck anglers did turn in stomachs. We just want a lot more. Right? We would love to have 1,000 stomachs from anglers that just saved them when they went out for the day and took out the stomachs and saved them for us and let us know, and we come and get them at some point, or they put them in a freezer where Creel can pick it up. Right? Like that's what we would love to happen. It's not something that a lot of anglers think about, or maybe they don't even know about, right? Like we've tried to do these outreach events, and perhaps we're not reaching everybody, but we would love it. And we could even supply, if there's someone that would do it every time, we would supply you with, all the bags and tags and everything else that you would need to be able to collect those stomachs. We're happy to collaborate. Why not more focus on data in the Southeast rivers, mainly Huron and Clinton rivers, where a bulk of steelhead angling population lives, and also utilize these two rivers? Yeah, we didn't collect any data from rivers. We stuck to the main lakes. And so, as much as I would love to be able to study, catch as many steelhead as I possibly could on some of these rivers and collect their diets. For this project in particular, we're sticking to the main lakes. Anonymous said it looked like there was a substantial uptick in the amount of alewife and salmon diets in 2019. What do you attribute that to? More alewife is my guess, and I think the prey fish surveys bear that out, and that there were more alewife in 2019 than there were in some of the previous years. So the question that I still have with regarding the preponderance of or prevalence of alewife in fish from MH1, from that very northern part, is where are they coming from? And maybe Jory, you have a good answer for that, or someone has an answer for that.
No, I really don't. I mean, you can postulate that they're coming over from Lake Michigan, or at least that if there were a reseeding event that allowed for reproduction in Lake Huron, it would likely be fish coming over from Lake Michigan.
Yeah.
That'd be a whole nother study to figure out.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we had 3 lines of thought. One is that what Jory just mentioned, that alewife are coming over. The second is that, Chinook salmon, coho salmon, these fish move and they can move fast. And so if an angler happens to be fishing relatively near the straits, but fishing out of a port in Huron, maybe they're consuming alewife in Lake Michigan and come in, and being landed in the Lake Huron basin. We wouldn't know, right? We don't record exactly where anglers are catching these fish. And so that's another idea, although I suspect that Jory's hypothesis is much tighter and better.
All right, Brian.